How are you doing, everyone? This is Dr. B from Dr. B Teaches and the 7 Generation Podcast. Today we're diving into a very important topic regarding sacred places and indigenous communities. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the fight to save Oak Flat. Oak Flat has long been regarded as a sacred place to the San Carlos Apache, and this fight to save Oak Flat is much more than just simply a battle over the land. It's about indigenous sovereignty, religious freedom, environmental justice, and the ongoing clash between corporations who want to maximize profits and, of course, native rights. Oak Flat has been a cultural and spiritual center for the Apache people for generations, and I've had the honor of being able to visit the area on several occasions. I have a lot of friends and people that I care about who live on the San Carlos Apache Reservation, and of course now Resolution Copper. This is a foreign-owned mining company. They plan to turn this sacred land into a massive crater, a crater that would be the size of the Eiffel Tower, basically ending the Apache's religious connection to this land forever. And despite legal challenges and widespread public opposition to the mining of Oak Flat, the United States government continues to back this project. So for today's show, I want to break down the history of Oak Flat, its significance, and the legal battle that is ongoing to protect this area, and what this fight really does mean for the future of indigenous rights, environmental protection, and the ongoing struggle of indigenous communities to protect their sacred places. And what I really want the listeners and the viewers to know is that these places that indigenous communities deem sacred are central to the cultural and religious spiritual practices of indigenous communities. So without a connection to the land, without a connection to these sacred places, you're effectively destroying a way of life, a worldview, a philosophy, a way of looking at the universe. Since time immemorial, the Western Apache and other native peoples have gathered at Oak Flat, which is outside of present-day Superior, Arizona, as a way of practicing their religious ceremonies that cannot take place anywhere else. Several Apache ceremonies are practiced at Oak Flat, including the sunrise dance, which is an important coming-of-age ceremony for Apache girls. The land is also the home of rare plants, springs, and rock formations that are deeply tied to Apache spirituality and religious traditions. To the Apache, Oak Flat is as sacred as Mount Sinai is to the Jews, or Mecca is to Muslims. It is a place of prayer, a way for people to connect with the Creator, with Usen, and a renewal of cultural identity that is tied to the San Carlos Apache community. For generations, the Apache have safeguarded Oak Flat from harmful industrial practices. However, those protections were stripped in December of 2014 when a last-minute provision was slipped into a so-called must-pass defense bill authorizing land transfer to Resolution Copper. This included the sacred place we call Oak Flat. Late in 2024, myself and members of the Pacific Savages Motorcycle Club and Savages MC were able to visit Oak Flat and spend some time with Dr. Winsler Nosey. He has been on the front lines of the defense of this sacred territory for several years, and he spent about a good hour with us just explaining just how important this land is to the Apache, and also how this is a fight for not just the Apache, but in defense of all indigenous religious traditions. Dr. Nosey also explained that Oak Flat isn't just a place where Apache ceremonies are held. That it's not just a holy site for their rituals, but that many of their ancestors are buried in and around the area as well. And that the San Carlos Indian Reservation was really a prison. The United States Army once referred to it as Hell's 40 acres. And so they imprisoned the Apache and they didn't allow them to practice their way of life, to go to the sacred places that are central to the Apache worldview. And that over the years, the Apache have reclaimed their religion by going back to these sacred places, and just how this has improved the social, the psychological, and the spiritual well-being of the Apache. And so when I left Oak Flat, I really had a really great understanding of just how important these sacred places are to the Apache and other indigenous communities. I've also had the opportunity to sit and talk with Nolan Pike, who is the granddaughter of Dr. Nosey, and she's incredibly young, incredibly inspirational, but she has spent pretty much her entire life working on the front lines with her family, with her community, to defend Oak Flat, to defend the spiritual and cultural traditions of her community. And it's incredibly disturbing that the United States government and Resolution Copper would make this deal behind closed doors that could lead to the potential destruction of a worldview that has been around since the beginning of time. Let's talk a little bit more about Resolution Copper. This is one of the largest multinational mining giants in the world. They're run by BHP and Rio Tinto, and they plan to use block cave mining to extract copper from Oak Flat. And this is one of the most destructive methods. It will create a 2-mile wide, over 1,000 feet deep crater, permanently destroying this sacred territory. If Rio Tinto sounds familiar, it's because the company has a track record of cultural destruction. Back in 2020, it blew up a 46,000-year-old indigenous site in Australia. This sparked international outrage, and of course now they plan to erase another sacred site, this time on Apache land. If Resolution Copper is allowed to mine at Oak Flat, it wouldn't simply be an environmental disaster. This would be an attack on Apache religious freedom and indigenous sovereignty. Sacred places like Oak Flat are central to the spiritual and cultural outlook of indigenous communities. And when these places are destroyed, you're effectively destroying a spiritual and religious worldview. And I don't think that people quite understand that for indigenous communities, the land, the resources, the culture, and the language are all interconnected. And so when you destroy the land, you're effectively destroying a way of life. And it's also important to note that these places are so significant to the social and the psychological well-being of indigenous communities. These are places where people have buried their ancestors, where indigenous communities go to practice religious ceremonies that their people have been practicing for generations. And when you destroy the land, you're effectively taking away that connection that human beings, that tribal communities have had with the land since the beginning of time. And this is incredibly destructive, not just to the ecosystems, but to human beings as a whole. It's also important to note that virtually every federally recognized tribe in Arizona is opposed to the mining of Oak Flat, as well as the National Congress of American Indians and several religious organizations do not want to see Resolution Copper destroy this area. These organizations, these tribal communities know that it's about fighting to protect religious and spiritual rights. It's about religious freedom. It's about indigenous communities being able to practice a way of life that predates the United States, that predates this destructive economic system that we call capitalism. And of course, the United States government continues to prioritize making money, profits over indigenous rights, profits over the well-being of the biosphere, which all human beings are reliant on for survival. The Apache Stronghold, which is a coalition of Apaches, other native peoples, and indigenous allies, have been leading the fight to stop the transfer of Oak Flat to Resolution Copper. In Apache Stronghold versus the United States, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals did rule recently against halting the transfer, effectively allowing the destruction of Oak Flat to proceed. 5 dissenting judges strongly opposed the ruling, stating that the court tragically erred by failing to protect indigenous religious freedom. Nevertheless, the transfer was not stopped by the Ninth Circuit Court. As it stands now, the situation is incredibly dire. The case is being taken all the way to the Supreme Court, and by the summer of 2025, the Supreme Court will decide whether or not they're even going to hear the case. Let's talk a little bit about the structures of settler colonialism and capitalism, which is built into these structures in the destruction of indigenous lands. This fight over Oak Flat is part of a larger pattern. Again and again, capitalism as an economic system prioritizes the profit of the power elite over not just indigenous communities, but really all peoples. The same logic that drives pipelines through tribal territories, that displaces indigenous communities for resource extraction, or poisons water supplies for the purpose of economic development, is truly what's at work here. This is what settler colonialism and capitalism are all about. It's about the elimination of tribal communities. Tribal communities are a roadblock to wealth building, which is central to the system of capitalism. So the whole point of capitalism, it's not about job creation, it's not about economic development, it's about creating wealth for the power elite. And in this system, nothing is sacred. And the United States government has consistently, over the decades, sided with corporations over indigenous peoples. And like I said, this is not about job creation or energy security. This is about creating more wealth, more power for the elites. One of the tenets of settler colonialism and the point of capitalism is to completely appropriate indigenous territories for the purpose of wealth building. And along with this, the erasure of indigenous culture, history, and identity. So if we allow for Oak Flat to be mined, to be destroyed by Resolution Copper, we are allowing the destruction of a religious worldview, of a culture that again predates the United States, to be destroyed. The good news is that the fight to save Oak Flat is far from over. Apache Stronghold continues to push forward using the courts, and public support for protecting sacred places like Oak Flat continues to grow in the general public. So what is it that we can do to help? Well, we need to start by educating ourselves about the significance of places like Oak Flat to indigenous culture and religious worldviews. And we need to also share this information with others. The more awareness we raise, the harder it is for corporations to operate in secrecy. We also need to support indigenous-led organizations like Apache Stronghold and others who are working to protect their sacred places. And we also need to demand that lawmakers and the courts uphold Indigenous religious freedom and environmental protection. Public awareness and pressure on the federal government works. We've seen it before, and we can do it again. Let me leave you with this. Oak Flat is a test of our country's commitment to religious freedom, to Indigenous rights, the people who have been here, who have lived on this land, the caretakers of what we call Turtle Island, and of course, environmental justice. If we allow this sacred place to be destroyed, we're sending a message that Native voices, Native culture, Indigenous identity doesn't matter. But if we stand up, we can send a completely different message, a message that says protecting Indigenous religious freedom and sovereignty matters. We also need to send the message that corporate greed and the power elite can't just go and destroy the land at the expense of human beings, that we have to start putting the welfare of our communities, our biosphere, over profits. It truly is imperative that we interrogate these destructive systems, that we interrogate this type of capitalism that is centered all around building wealth for the elites. It has nothing to do with making our lives better. It has nothing to do with protecting the birthright of our children or protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. It has nothing to do with caring about 7 generations into the future. We want to have something that's left, not just for ourselves, not just for our children, but the 7 generations coming. And corporations, the system of settler colonialism, doesn't care about any of these things. So now is the time for us to stand, to fight, and to begin to interrogate and question this type of capitalism, these types of systems where nothing is held sacred any longer. And I just want to say much love and respect to all of our Apache relatives and the San Carlos Apache people who are working hard to protect their sacred homelands. I know that on February 20th through the 23rd, the San Carlos Apache are holding a march and a run. They've been doing this for 11 years now. So if you're in the area and you want to support, you can attend one of these events. Also, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in to Dr. B Teaches and the 7 Generation Podcast. If you found this episode to be interesting or helpful in any way, feel free to share and also consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. And as always, I'm really curious what your thoughts are. I enjoy reading your comments, so feel free to comment below. I have memberships now, so if you want to support my content and the work that I do, I would really appreciate that. And as always, stay in the fight, continue to educate yourself, and let's take a stand against corporate greed. Now's the time. I know that these corporations are incredibly powerful. They have so much wealth. They have so much pull in politics. It almost seems as if these fights are just way too daunting. But if we come together, we show solidarity, and we work in unity, we can do amazing things together. If you all have Instagram, you can follow me there. Just search 7gen Podcast. I'm also on TikTok. My handle is Merciless Savages. My podcast, the 7 Generation Podcast, can be found and streamed on all major platforms. All right, y'all, this is Dr. B. Don't forget, stay informed, stay engaged, and let's keep fighting for what's right. Until next time, y'all take care.